I'm Anders Hagstrom with the Daily Caller. We are here for your Thursday morning dispatch. Dylan, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so let's just get right into Biden's town hall that he did with CNN last night, because there were a few moments. Obviously, he had some decent moments, and he had some moments where he seemed to have crossed his wires a little bit. And I want to talk about some of the ones that stood out to me, at least, and that was him going after Fox News for their messaging on vaccinations. He essentially said that they had an altar call moment, or like a religious experience that caused them to suddenly, more recently, start calling for their viewers to get vaccinated, which is weird because I've been watching Fox News shows calling for people to get vaccinated for months and months and months now. I mean, obviously, like the Fox News has a ton of opinion shows, and so a lot of those shows vary on an individual basis. But there were several shows over the course of the past couple months that were calling for their viewers to get vaccinated. So I don't really know what tree Biden is barking up when it comes to that sort of language. And the other one that I thought was really bad for Biden last night was when he started talking about Republicans going after Democrats for being anti-police. He essentially said that Republicans who attack Democrats this way are, quote, lying. Which is amazing to me, because if you look over the past year and a half of American politics and how Democrats have responded to the George Floyd protests, to Black Lives Matter, to all these different movements, to the defund the police movement in particular, and all they've done is almost universally embrace these guys. They've had nothing but good words. Democrats across the country, on like a majority of Democrats across the country, on the local level, the state government level, and on the federal level, have encouraged these protests. They've encouraged these riots, more or less. And now there were some Democrats who spoke out against this, especially in the wake of the 2020 election. There were a few Democrats who recognized the damage that it did to their party, the damage that this defund the police movement did to their party at the ballot box in 2020. And they lost seats in the House because of this, largely. But for Biden to stand up on this stage with with CNN and to tell the American people that Republicans are simply lying when they call out this behavior from Democrats it's remarkable, and it's essentially just gaslighting, because we all were alive for the past year and a half. We all saw what Democrats were talking about. We all still see what Democrats are talking about. And for Biden to simply say that no, that never happened it's incredible. It's incredible for him to be doing that on the stage. Dylan, though, what were a few of the moments that stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, some of the same stuff as far as the anti-police comments, and our colleague Shelby Talcott asked after this event, what is his defense for that? Is that really true? Does he really believe that? Essentially, was along the lines of what she was asking. He equated the anti-police wing of the Democratic Party, to the extent that it exists in his mind, to people in the Republican Party that believe in things like QAnon, for example. And politically savvy answer is what I said, because it kind of equates and makes both these things seem fringe. But there's certainly more elected Democrats that have expressed some kind of anti-police sentiment than Republican elected officials at the top level that have expressed belief that, as Biden put it, that Democrats are drinking the blood of children and things like that. That's actually what he cited. So, it is it's smart by Biden to be trying to marginalize these people from the party. And he used his line that he is the party and he decides what the party is. But that's not how parties work. Parties are coalitions, especially the Democratic Party. They do have a wider, more diverse, I don't mean that in a racial sense even, but just as far as, how many different groups and interest groups are in their coalition. They have a more diverse coalition than the Republican Party, and more, wide range of kind of where people stand, from people like Biden that have expressed, opposition to the defund the police stuff, to people like AOC or Ilhan Omar and those types that have just openly embraced it. So I thought his way of navigating around that, while dishonest, probably was going to be somewhat effective, if we're being honest. But then also with the COVID stuff, he answered a question from a black gentleman that asked him about, black people not wanting to take the vaccine necessarily as much. This man had his wedding with his wife during the pandemic, and they required vaccination. And he said, a lot of people in our communities don't necessarily trust the government and don't trust these vaccines. How can you reach out to our community essentially and kind of convince them that this is a safe thing to do and realistic and reasonable thing to do. And Don Lemon echoed some of those thoughts, and I just thought that was interesting because we've seen this dichotomy play out for months now, that certain communities, certain types of people that are hesitant to get the vaccine, they are treated as, reasonable skeptics, people that have a reason to be skeptical of what's happening in the government, people that are rightfully concerned about the safety of vaccines, things like that, versus, again, how you've explained that him talking about Fox News and conservatives and Republicans and white men and all these various groups, that they're crazy people that are opposed to taking the vaccine, and we need, Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity to go, personally start jabbing people, these old white crazy men in rural areas that don't want to get the vaccine. And I think it was just, I haven't seen a lot of people making that point, pointing out this dichotomy that we saw, within minutes of each other essentially last night. But that's something that jumped out to me as well. And I think there's a little bit of, there's a kernel of truth in there, that if you were a Black American, you could be reasonably skeptical of the government given everything that's happened in this country over hundreds of years. But to kind of not extend any of that same favorability or benefit of the doubt to anybody else that's also skeptical of the vaccine, even though, we've seen that it's very safe and effective, is just an interesting pattern to observe, I thought.
Yeah, and moving on to our second story here, obviously we've been hearing a lot about Nancy Pelosi's January 6th committee. She was looking for Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, to nominate 5 Republicans to actually participate in this committee. He did so earlier this week, but she's rejecting 2 of those names, and those names are Jim Jordan and Jim Banks, Ohio Rep. Jim Jordan and Indiana Rep. Jim Banks. Now, she says that these people are too radical to be participating in this committee. Obviously, especially Jim Jordan has been one of President Trump's most vocal defenders for years now. He's been very aggressively in favor of Trump for a long time. So she is not a fan of either of these people. Dylan, how does Kevin McCarthy react here, and what's really the path forward? Like, are there going to be any Republicans on this committee at the end of the day?
Yeah, well, McCarthy reacted by pulling the other members that he proposed off the committee as well, and I guess it remains to be seen what's going to happen. I mean, you saw some Republicans calling for this. Liz Cheney, I believe, said that we still need to try to move forward with this process, even with things kind of blowing up as they just did in the last 48 hours. But I'm going to both sides this issue if I'm allowed to do that. I don't think either side at this point, it's clear to me, or at least the principal players involved in this, the Pelosi's and the McCarthy's, are interested in really getting to the bottom of this and having a true non-political, thorough, fair, even-handed process. I mean, Pelosi, to set up the committee the way she did, and for her to have the power to tell the Republican side who they want to have on the committee, and to make it an imbalanced committee and kind of go about it in this partisan way that she has, I think indicates a lack of seriousness. And I do think McCarthy, frankly, nominating people like Jim Jordan, and say what you want about Jim Jordan, but he's expressed a lot of opposition and kind of skepticism about the value of investigating all this. And, as you said, he's a strong ally of the president. I think if you, out of the entire Republican caucus, you could certainly find 5 people that would be, probably less biased and more likely to get to the bottom of things. But McCarthy did pick some people in this group of 5 that he knew were going to, ruffle feathers. And it was very obviously a provocative pick. So I think both sides have clearly shown that at this point they're not serious about it. I think as soon as the ship sailed on the original kind of bipartisan agreement that collapsed in the Senate when Republicans didn't get enough on board with it, was kind of the end of any hope of a nonpartisan congressional investigation into this. And I think that's unfortunate. I think there's a lot of stuff we don't know about what happened on January 6th still, and certain things about who was involved in very serious acts, who was involved in less serious acts, who was involved in kind of deliberate planning of violence, and who was kind of just caught up in the moment as showing up at a protest that got out of hand. And I think it'd be valuable for us to know more about that and especially how the Capitol Police allowed this to happen, because frankly, that's the biggest issue, I think, is that it should have been allowed to happen in the first place, what did. And I think it's unfortunate we're not going to get to that, it looks like, at least in Congress, but I'm not surprised. And I think both sides shoulder some of that blame.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the fact that this committee is being viewed as so nakedly partisan is almost a victory for Republicans because that's how they wanted it to be viewed from the start. I mean, obviously, even when they were voting on this sort of bipartisan group earlier this year, their argument against that even was that it would just be a partisan sort of clown show. And now it sort of has become that because they didn't because Republicans and Democrats couldn't find a common ground on an actual bipartisan
They spoke it
investigation of
into
what happened.
existence, you could almost say.
Yeah, exactly. Moving on to our last story here, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. He has been making waves in the Pentagon with a lot of his. Well, I guess both he and President Biden have been making waves with their critical race theory implementation into the military. Obviously, it's almost been the defining sort of actions of the Pentagon under President Biden so far has been this implementation of critical race theory, cracking down on so-called extremism, which sometimes just blends into support for President Trump within the military. I mean, obviously there is extremism within the military, and it's fine to go after that, but we need to get our definitions really straightened out there. But Lloyd Austin sort of crossed his wires here again yesterday when he said that he wants the military to be apolitical. He thinks it's really important to him for the military to be apolitical. Well, I would suggest that he has perhaps failed on that that goal of his over the past few months because he is definitely his policies have definitely worked to politicize the military to an extent that I mean President Trump went there as well, obviously with banning transgender people in the military. I mean this was a very political decision, but. It's remarkable for him to be passing all these policies or for to be imposing all these policies and then simply say, "Oh yeah, I don't think I'm being very political. I don't think I'm being political at all. I think I'm being totally impartial." Dylan, what do you think about this?
Well, the first thing that crossed my mind when I saw this is that, first of all, I agree with you, Lloyd Austin. I think the military should be apolitical. And that's why it's unfortunate. As someone, I like to think I follow defense policy and foreign policy pretty closely. It's kind of a hobby interest of mine, even though it's not something I necessarily write about a ton in my career, but it's something I pay close attention to, keep an eye on. And I see more comments and Lloyd Austin popping up more often in the news frequently for comments like this and talking about critical race theory and talking about extremism in the military than I see of him talking about, our withdrawal from Afghanistan or the threat posed by China or any of these, geopolitical issues that our military is having to deal with. So I think he's correct in saying that we should want the military to be apolitical. I just wish he would actually, try carrying that out maybe and focusing on that. Maybe the less he talks about trying to be apolitical and the more he talks about, actually, doing that or just not talking about politics at all. Maybe we just shouldn't talk about extremism in the military that allegedly exists, or maybe we just shouldn't be talking about this, critical race theory implementation that they're trying to do. Maybe that would solve the problem. I don't know. It seems like the source of the problem is the one complaining about the problem to me.
Yeah, I think as soon as you have Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley testifying to Congress that he wants to understand white rage, I think that that means you pretty much failed at your goal at making the military apolitical. I think that's a sort of defining.
If you want to depoliticize the military, maybe talk to that guy because he
Yeah.
certainly is. He seems to be problem number one on that front.
Exactly. Anyways, Patriots, thank you so much for watching. We will catch you later this evening.